I arrived at the wedding early, dressed in my best suit. It wasn't the fanciest, but it was the one I wore for special occasions, dark navy, freshly pressed, with a tie that my daughter, Evelyn, had picked out for me years ago when she was still my little girl. Back then, she thought I was the strongest, smartest, most dependable man in the world. That was before she outgrew me. Before she decided that having a father like me wasn't good enough. The venue was breathtaking, an elegant hall, draped in white and gold, chandeliers casting soft, warm light over hundreds of well-dressed guests. I recognized some faces, mostly from the years I had worked hard to give Evelyn everything she could ever want. Teachers from her private school, colleagues from her first internship, the places I had pulled strings and emptied my pockets to make sure she had the best start in life. But I wasn't one of them. I felt it the moment I stepped inside. The way people glanced at me, then quickly looked away. The way conversation stopped when I passed. I knew that look. The kind rich people gave when they thought someone didn't belong. I adjusted my tie and forced myself to ignore it. Today wasn't about me, it was about my daughter. I told myself that over and over. I had been waiting for this moment for years, picturing the day I'd walk her down the aisle. I'd imagined her holding on to my arm, looking up at me with a nervous but excited smile, just like when she was little. But that moment never came. Evelyn was already standing near the altar when I spotted her. She was radiant, breathtaking in her wedding dress, a vision of everything a father dreams for his daughter. For a second, pride swelled in my chest. But then she turned away. I caught the hesitation in her eyes, the quick flicker of discomfort. And then she did something that hit me harder than I ever expected. She reached for another man's arm, her stepfather's. "This is the man who raised me," she said, her voice loud and clear, meant for everyone to hear. I felt the words like a slap across my face. Raised her? I stood there, frozen, my breath caught in my chest. I had been there from the moment she was born. I was the one who stayed up rocking her to sleep when she cried through the night. I was the one who patched up her knees when she fell off her bike, who worked overtime to pay for her ballet lessons, her school trips, her dream college. I was the one who made sure she never wanted for anything. And yet, in front of everyone, she erased me from her story like I had never mattered. The guests clapped politely, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. Some even nodded approvingly, as if this other man had done something noble by stepping into a role I had never abandoned. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move, to sit down, to act like it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. And then came Laura. She was dressed to perfection, draped in luxury, the kind of life I had worked so hard to provide for her. She stood in the middle of the reception hall, her wine glass raised, her voice ringing out with confidence. "I just want to say," she began, pausing for dramatic effect, "that I am so proud of my daughter. I raised her alone. I did everything in my power to give her the life she deserved. My blood ran cold. Alone?" The room was silent for a moment. Then laughter erupted. People clapped. They cheered for her. And I sat there, sinking deeper into my chair, my fists clenched under the table. This was my reward? After years of sacrifice, of breaking my back, of doing everything for them, I was now the absent father, the irresponsible man who had abandoned them? I looked at Evelyn, searching her face for any sign of guilt, any sign that she knew this wasn't true. But she just smiled, nodding, accepting the praise. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for her to glance at me, to acknowledge the lie. Maybe even to stand up and say, "That's not true. My father was there for me." But she didn't. She let them believe it. I felt something inside me break. Not just pain finality. The kind of pain that doesn't fade. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken. I pushed back my chair, stood up, and walked away. I didn't say a word. I didn't make a scene. I didn't let them see me crumble. I walked out of that wedding hall and into the cold night air, feeling lighter than I had in years. Because in that moment, I knew I was done, and they would never see me again. I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The wedding hall was still alive with laughter, music, and celebration, but I had no part in it. Not anymore. The engine rumbled beneath me, but I didn't drive off just yet. Instead, I stared through the windshield, my mind replaying everything that had just happened. Evelyn's words. Laura's cruel speech. The sound of the guests laughing at my expense. I had spent years, decades, breaking my back to make sure they never wanted for anything. I had taken extra shifts, worked weekends, climbed into filthy pipes, and scrubbed oil off my hands just to give them a life that was better than mine. I had skipped meals to pay for Evelyn's ballet recitals. I had ignored my own exhaustion to help her with late-night school projects. I had sacrificed everything. And for what? So I could sit there, humiliated, while the woman I once loved rewrote history and my own daughter pretended I didn't exist. A bitter chuckle escaped my lips. I had always believed that love, real love, was about sacrifice. That if you gave enough, worked hard enough, and provided enough, people would see it, appreciate it. I was wrong. I pulled out my phone, my fingers surprisingly steady as I dialed my lawyer. He answered on the third ring. "Michael, I want you to stop everything," I said, my voice calm. Too calm. "Cut off all financial support. Effective immediately." There was a pause. "You sure about this? You've been covering Evelyn's living expenses, her car, her tuition." "Not anymore." Silence. I could hear him shuffling papers on the other end, probably hesitant to push me when my mind was clearly made up. "All right," he finally said. "I'll take care of it." And just like that, I was free. I had spent years as their safety net, the invisible force that kept their world running smoothly. But they had made it clear I was nothing to them. So I would become nothing to them. I started the truck and drove. Not aimlessly, not out of anger, but with purpose. There was one last thing I needed to do. The house I had paid for stood just as I had left it, pristine and polished, the kind of place that screamed privilege and comfort. The kind of place that had cost me my health, my energy, and my very soul to afford. I stepped inside without knocking. It was still my home, technically. But even as I crossed the threshold, I felt like a stranger. Laura was lounging in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand, scrolling through her phone. When she saw me, she didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked bored. "Michael," she said lazily, "did you come back to apologize?" I laughed, an actual laugh this time. Short, sharp, cold. "I came to collect my things," I said. She rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." I didn't answer. I just walked past her, heading toward the bedroom. Evelyn was in the hallway, still in her wedding dress, adjusting her earrings in the mirror. When she saw me, she hesitated for a split second. Then, just like at the wedding, she averted her gaze and acted like I wasn't there. Like I was invisible. I waited, gave her a chance. A moment. An opening to say something, anything. She didn't. So I moved on. In the bedroom, I grabbed what little belonged to me. My clothes, my tools, my father's old watch that had been buried in a drawer for years. I didn't bother with anything else. Not the furniture, not the expensive gifts I had bought over the years, not the framed photos that told a false story of a perfect family. Laura appeared in the doorway, watching me pack. "You'll be back," she said confidently, swirling the wine in her glass. "You always come back." I zipped up my bag. "Not this time." She smirked, shaking her head. "You're overreacting, Michael. We both know you can't survive without us." I stepped past her, pausing just long enough to meet her gaze. "No," I said quietly. "You can't survive without me." And with that, I walked out the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because I knew, this time, I was really gone. I never checked in on them. Not once. Not because I didn't care. No, I had cared too much for too long. But because I had finally learned that some lessons in life can't be taught. They have to be felt. And so, while they carried on as if I had never existed, I moved on. I rented a small but comfortable apartment, started taking jobs on my own terms, and for the first time in decades, I put myself first. I didn't miss the weight of my past life. If anything, I felt lighter. But Laura and Evelyn? Their world was about to come crashing down. It started with the bills. The mortgage, the car payments, the credit card statements. All things they had once tossed aside like minor inconveniences. They had never worried about such things before because they had me. But without my money quietly flowing into their accounts, reality set in fast. Laura, always the picture of elegance and self-importance, was no longer the untouchable queen of her social circle. She had spent years basking in the admiration of women who envied her lifestyle, her home, her so-called independence. Now, those same women whispered behind her back when the designer handbags stopped appearing and the salon visits became less frequent. At first, she refused to believe it. She assured herself I was just sulking, that I'd eventually crawl back, begging for forgiveness. But weeks passed, and her calls went straight to voicemail. Her text remained unread. She tried emailing me, even reaching out to some of my old friends, but I had made sure there was no way back. And from that moment on, things only got worse. The fight started. The cold shoulder treatment followed. Daniel was no longer the affectionate, doting husband she had once flaunted to the world. He became distant, uninterested. Then, one evening, she came home to find his suitcases packed by the door. "I'm going back to London," he said flatly. Evelyn's throat tightened. "For work. For good." Her stomach dropped. "You're leaving me?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Evelyn, I married the daughter of a rich man. I didn't sign up for this." Tears welled in her eyes. I'll figure something out, I swear. Just give me some time." Daniel picked up his bags, cutting her off. "I'm sorry, Evelyn, but I didn't marry a problem." And just like that, he was gone. Back at the house, Laura was no better off. She had always prided herself on her status, but status alone couldn't pay the bills. Creditors called daily. The electricity flickered on and off. She tried selling a few expensive items, but soon, even those funds ran dry. Her so-called friends had begun distancing themselves, finding reasons to cancel lunch dates and ignore her calls. The same women who had once envied her now laughed behind her back. Desperate, she tried reaching me again. Her messages turned from cold demands to saccharine pleas. "Michael, I think we should talk. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. I made a mistake. I miss you. Please, call me." I never responded. The final blow came when she received a foreclosure notice on the house. The home I had paid for, the very place where I had been insulted, cast aside, and humiliated, was no longer hers to claim. Laura and Evelyn had spent years believing they were above me, that I was nothing but an afterthought, a shadow of their past, someone they could discard when it suited them. But they had never truly known what it was like to lose. Now they did. And I was finally free. I woke up every morning with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in decades, there was no weight on my shoulders, no endless cycle of sacrifice with no appreciation in return. The house I had once called home, filled with resentment and cold indifference, was gone. The woman who had worn my last name like a convenience rather than a commitment was nothing more than a chapter one had finally closed. My so-called daughter, who had erased me from her life the moment she found richer pastures, was nothing more than a distant memory. And I was finally living. With no one siphoning off my hard-earned money, I put everything into my business. What started as a modest plumbing company, a small operation that I had built with my own two hands, soon transformed into something far greater. I upgraded my equipment, hired a team of dedicated professionals, and expanded my services beyond residential plumbing to large-scale commercial projects. Contracts started rolling in from real estate developers, luxury hotels, and even government projects. Before I knew it, Carter Plumbing and Solutions had become a name that carried weight in the industry. Money was no longer a concern. I had more of it than I had ever imagined. But more than that, I had peace. I bought a new house, nothing ostentatious, but elegant and comfortable. A place that truly felt like mine. I surrounded myself with good people, friends who respected me, employees who admired my work ethic, and business partners who valued what I brought to the table. I no longer had to prove my worth to anyone. My success spoke for itself. And then, there was Sophia. I met her at a corporate networking event, though she wasn't the kind of woman you'd expect to find at such gatherings. While others were busy flashing their wealth and boasting about their accomplishments, Sophia was different. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her laughter was genuine, and when she spoke, she actually listened rather than waiting for her turn to talk. She wasn't impressed by flashy titles or bank accounts. In fact, when she first asked me what I did for a living, and I told her I was in plumbing, she simply smiled and said, "An honest job." That's rare these days. No judgment. No condescending remarks. Just respect. We started seeing each other more often, long walks, quiet dinners, real conversations. She didn't care about my success, And that was precisely what made her stand out. For the first time in my life, I was with someone who saw me, not what I could provide. It was a new feeling, one I wasn't used to, but I embraced it. Meanwhile, Laura and Evelyn were still clinging to the illusion that I would return, that I would swoop in like a fool and fix everything for them. They hadn't learned. They refused to learn. Laura tried calling again. This time, her messages took a new tone, less arrogance, more desperation. Michael, I don't know why you're doing this. We were family once. Evelyn is struggling. How can you turn your back on your own daughter? We need to talk. Please. I ignored every single one. Evelyn, on the other hand, made no attempts to contact me directly. Her pride wouldn't allow it. But I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was bouncing from one failed job to another, struggling to maintain the image she had once effortlessly projected. The people who used to admire her now avoided her. The husband who had promised her the world had long since moved on. She had bet everything on the belief that I would always be there, no matter how she treated me. But I wasn't. And that, more than anything, was her real downfall. One evening, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, Sophia joined me, a warm cup of tea in her hands. She leaned against the railing, looking at me with quiet curiosity. "You've been quiet tonight," she said. "Thinking about something?" I let out a slow breath, staring out at the skyline. "Just the past." She nodded, not pressing for details. That was another thing I loved about her. She never pried. She let me speak when I was ready. After a moment, she asked, "Do you ever regret walking away?" I turned to look at her, really look at her. The warmth in her eyes, the understanding in her voice. She wasn't someone who used me, who drained me, who belittled me. She was someone who stood beside me. And that was all the answer I needed. "No," I said, a slow smile forming. "Not for a second." Evelyn never imagined her life would turn out this way. She had been the perfect bride, draped in white lace, standing before hundreds of guests, basking in their admiration. That day, she had felt invincible, untouchable, elevated above all the common struggles of life. Now, she sat alone in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, an old mattress on the floor, and unopened eviction notices piling up on the small dining table. Her world had come crashing down. It had started with small inconveniences. First, the subtle shift in her husband's behavior. Less affection, fewer texts, more late nights at work. Then, the money stopped flowing as freely as before. When Evelyn had lived under Michael's financial security, there had never been a question of how things got paid. Bills were taken care of. Expenses were covered. But now, her credit cards were maxed out. The expensive designer handbags she once flaunted had been pawned off, one by one, just to buy groceries. And then, one day, her husband sat her down, a look of indifference in his eyes that sent ice through her veins. "This isn't working anymore," he had said, his voice eerily calm. Evelyn had blinked at him, confused. "What do you mean? I thought I was marrying someone from a respectable background," he continued, sipping his whiskey like this conversation meant nothing. "Turns out, you were only rich because of your father. And now that he's out of the picture, well," he shrugged, "you're not the woman I thought you were." It felt like a slap. Her mouth went dry. I gave up everything for this marriage. You said you loved me. I said a lot of things." He stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "You'll get the divorce papers in the mail. I'd suggest finding a cheaper place to live." And just like that, he was gone. Laura wasn't doing any better. For years, she had built her life around the comfort of Michael's money. She had never needed to worry about budgeting, never had to consider the consequences of her careless spending. Now, she was drowning. With no income, no savings, and a reputation built on wealth she no longer possessed, she found herself isolated. Friends she had once wined and dined with conveniently stopped answering her calls. Creditors came knocking. The expensive house she had paraded in front of others was foreclosed. She tried everything. She sent long, guilt-ridden messages to Michael, pleading for his help. No response. She showed up at his old office, only to find that he had moved locations to a high-rise building across town. Desperation turned to anger. How dare he ignore them after everything? After all the years they had been together? But deep down, she knew the truth. Michael was done, and he wasn't coming back. One afternoon, Evelyn sat in a small cafe, mindlessly stirring the cheap black coffee in front of her, flipping through an old magazine someone had left behind. She had been trying to distract herself, to forget the mess she was in, when something caught her eye. A full-page spread. There, in bold, gold letters at the top, was a headline, "From Plumber to Powerhouse, the Michael Carter Empire." Evelyn's breath hitched. Below the headline was a photo of her father, but not the man she had dismissed at her wedding, dressed in a worn suit that looked out of place among high society. This Michael Carter looked like someone completely different. He stood confidently in front of a glass skyscraper, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His strong, square jawline was clean-shaven, his eyes sharp and focused. He looked powerful, successful. Nothing about him resembled the man she had been so ashamed of. Her hands trembled as she read the article. It detailed his journey, how he had started with nothing, built his plumbing business from the ground up, and turned it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. It praised his work ethic, his business acumen, his relentless drive. It talked about how he had cut off the people who had drained him and how, since then, he had flourished. It didn't mention her or her mother, not even once. Evelyn felt sick. The truth hit her like a freight train. She had spent her entire life looking down on the man who had given her everything. She had thrown away his love, his support, and his sacrifices because she had been blinded by wealth and status. And now, she was nothing. And he was thriving. That night, Evelyn sat in her tiny apartment, her hands shaking as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. She had rehearsed what she would say 1,000 times in her head. "Dad, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please forgive me. I didn't know how much you did for me. Can we start over?" She just needed to hear his voice. The phone rang once, twice. Then, "Carter Plumbing and Solutions, how can I assist you?" A woman's voice. Professional. Polite. Evelyn cleared her throat. I need to speak with Mr. Carter." There was a pause. Then, with practiced efficiency, the woman replied, "May I ask who's calling?" Evelyn swallowed. "It's his daughter." Another pause. This time, it stretched longer. Finally, the woman's tone turned cold. Dismissive. "Mr. Carter is not interested in speaking with you." Click. The line went dead. Evelyn stared at the phone in disbelief. For the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be discarded. And it tasted bitter. Michael Carter sat at the head of the long, glass conference table in his sprawling corporate office, reviewing reports from his latest expansion deal. The skyline of the city stretched behind him, the late afternoon sun casting golden hues across his office. He had built all of this, without them. His phone buzzed. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, we have 2 visitors downstairs. They say they're family." Michael didn't need to ask who. He already knew. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. It had been over a year since he had seen their faces, since he had last spoken their names. He had moved on, built a life free of their shadows, but some ghosts refused to stay buried. "Should I send them away?" his assistant asked. Michael hesitated, then, against his better judgment, said, "Send them up." When the doors to his office opened, he barely recognized them. Laura, once the glamorous socialite, looked worn and frail, her expensive designer wardrobe replaced by ill-fitting, outdated clothes. Her once meticulously styled hair was now dull and unkempt. And Evelyn, his daughter, the girl he had once cherished more than anything, stood beside her mother, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. Michael remained seated, watching them with an unreadable expression. He let them be the first to speak. "Michael," Laura started, her voice barely above a whisper. She paused, glancing at Evelyn, as if searching for the right words. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Dad," her voice cracked. I know I don't deserve to call you that, but I needed to see you." Michael folded his hands in front of him. "Why now?" Laura stepped forward, her desperation evident. "We made mistakes, Michael. Terrible mistakes. And we've paid for them. We lost everything." Michael let out a bitter chuckle. "Everything? No. You lost money, status, comfort." He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "You don't even know what real loss is." Evelyn's lips trembled. "I know I hurt you. I was awful to you. And I was blind, but I see it now. I see what you did for me, how much you loved me, and how much I threw away. Michael tilted his head, considering her words. And what do you want from me now? An apology for walking away? A handout to fix your mess? Laura shook her head quickly. No, Michael. Just a second chance. A chance to make things right. Michael stood, his presence towering over them. He walked slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city. He had spent so many years fighting to prove his worth, only to realize he never had to. He had always been enough. He turned back to them, his voice calm but firm. You stood in a room full of people and humiliated me. You laughed while I was made to look like a fool. You pretended I didn't exist after everything I did for you. His eyes darkened. And now, when you have nothing, you come here, expecting me to welcome you with open arms. Evelyn sobbed, dropping to her knees. I'm sorry, Dad. I am so sorry. Michael's jaw tightened. I needed to hear those words a long time ago. He let the silence linger before delivering the final blow. But it doesn't change anything. Laura clutched his arm, but he pulled away. I spent years breaking my back for this family, giving you everything I had, and you spit on it. His voice hardened. Now, I have a new life. A better one. And there is no room in it for betrayal. Evelyn cried harder. Please, Dad. Michael stepped back. No, the word was final. He looked at them one last time, not with anger, not with hatred, but with indifference. Then he turned and walked away, leaving them to face the consequences of their own choices. Michael Carter sat on the balcony of his sprawling estate, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a masterpiece of oranges and purples, the air crisp with the scent of freshly cut grass. Inside, the warmth of his home hummed with life, his real family. Laughter echoed from the living room, where his wife, Sophia, played with their 2 young children. Their giggles were the sweetest sound he had ever known, a stark contrast to the hollow silence that had once filled his life. He sipped his whiskey, letting the amber liquid burn as he reflected on how everything had changed. That wedding day, once the most painful moment of his life, had been the beginning of his true freedom. After he had walked away from Laura and Evelyn for good, life had only gotten better. His business had grown beyond anything he had imagined. With no one siphoning his success, his wealth multiplied. He had expanded beyond plumbing, investing in construction, real estate, and even tech startups. His name became synonymous with success, but more importantly, with integrity. And then there was Sophia. She had come into his life when he wasn't looking for love. A woman with no interest in his money, no expectations beyond the simple joys of life. She had loved him for the man he was, not the bank account, not the reputation, just him. With her, he had found what he had never known before, a true partner. And now, years later, they had built something real, a home filled with love, respect, and the kind of happiness money could never buy. A soft patter of feet broke his thoughts. His daughter, Emily, no older than 6, climbed onto his lap, snuggling into his chest. Daddy, will you tuck us in? Michael smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Of course, sweetheart. He carried her inside, walking past framed photos of their family vacations, school drawings, and memories built on love, not obligation. As he settled his children into bed, his son, Jacob, looked up at him with sleepy eyes. Daddy, are you happy? Michael felt a lump in his throat. He had been asked many questions in his life, but never one so simple, so profound. He smiled, brushing the boy's hair back. Happier than I've ever been. As he turned off the light and stepped out of their room, he whispered to himself, I was never the problem. I was just with the wrong people. And with that, he closed the door on his past forever. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. What would you have done in Michael's place? Let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for more powerful stories, and until next time, see you soon.